Hi, my name is Jon Sammis, and I'm here to help you improve your photography skills. Whether it's to make quality photos for your scrapbook collection, or to post online to show your friends, or even if you're just getting started, there's always some things you can learn to improve. There's something all photographers have in common, and that is the camera. Whether it be a very expensive camera used to shoot professional sports or a Christmas present given to you by grandma, they are all capable of taking the same kind of photo. But for the uninitiated, let's take a dive into what parts a camera consists of. Let's start with the lenses. There's a different lens for a different task. There's short, medium, and long-range lenses, as represented by what you see here. Each of them has their own different uniqueness. For instance, the shorter lenses have a higher aperture rank, but we'll get in more on that later. The main idea of each lens is to have a specific purpose, whether you're shooting in low light or you're shooting a sporting event from the sidelines. A good word of advice is to always pick and choose your lenses before going into the event. You do not want to be scrambling to change lenses because you could miss some very important stuff. But for now, let's talk about what each lens can do and what they specialize in. When you buy a camera lens that goes on a DSLR, it comes with 2 to 3 different rings. Now, each ring has a specific purpose because it controls a different part of the camera. The first ring, which is noticed more towards the base of the lens, is the aperture ring, which sometimes have numbers. The aperture itself is a set of blades found within each lens. It regulates the amount of light that comes into the camera and hits the sensor. This is the lowest f-stop, while each f-stop above contracts the aperture to a point where only a little bit of light comes in. Now, besides light, this also affects depth of field. The depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest objects that a camera can focus on. The higher the f-stop, the thinner the depth of field. While there's many kinds of lenses on the market, there are 2 different types of lenses. In this case, as shown here, we have prime lenses as well as zoom lenses. Prime lenses have a wider aperture, which means an increased depth of field, but they also have a fixed range. These kind of lenses are most notably used in portrait photography. On the other hand, there are zoom lenses, which have a variable zoom but also come with a limited aperture. These are most notably used in sporting events or events where the subject could be moving around a lot. A very important word of advice is to always make sure your lenses are cleaned and protected. The camera glass can scratch and even break, which would lead to some unfortunate circumstances. So always make sure you have a lens cap on lenses you're not using. In the case of cleaning, a microfiber cloth would most likely work best. Some accessories that could help in certain situations include tripods, camera flashes, as well as lens hoods. They aren't important to have, but they definitely help in the right situations. Most high-end cameras have a built-in flash, but it's not very reliable. The speed flash attaches to the top of your DSLR and syncs with your camera to operate in the best of low light. As for powering it, most flashes have a power source that won't drain the camera of its original battery life. In this case, my camera flash here is powered by 4 AA batteries. Now that we've covered the basics, you should be ready to get out and take some shots. In this next section, I'll give you a quick rundown on what the camera can do to make the shot you want. While out in your environment, there are some techniques you need to learn in order to make sure your photo comes out the best. First off is not to fight the light. If you're shooting outside and the sun is at your back, that's good, that's what you want, because that means the subject, which would be in front of you, would be lit up. Another issue people run into is the intensity of the lighting. If you're outside, you have no control over the sun, but you can position yourself in the shade to make sure the sun bounces off something reflective, say glass and other hard objects for a hard light, or even bouncing it off something like tile for a softer light. 3 different parts go into taking a photograph that the camera can adjust for. First off is shutter speed, second is the ISO, and the third is the aperture, which we discussed earlier. Now the shutter speed determines how fast the shutter would fire, and in this case, the highest being 0.004 of a second, and the lowest being 1. Every event calls for a different speed, depending if it's sports or just an indoor lecture. The lighting is the biggest factor that goes into which shutter speed you should pick. For sporting events that are outdoor in a sunny environment, you can use a higher shutter speed to compensate for a lower ISO. This would make a perfectly crisp image that can encapsulate all that you need. Now, if you go down to, say, 1, T or B, T standing for timer, and B standing for bulb, you can determine how long the shutter is open by how long you hold down the red button, which my finger is on now. The next thing to focus on is the ISO, which is the camera's ability to compensate for loss of light. Now, since I'm outdoors, I'm shooting at low, and that means that the camera doesn't need to do a whole lot of work in order to compensate for the image being taken. If you are in a dark lecture hall, you can set the ISO to a higher number in order to pick up more light that would be occasionally lost to the shutter. An alternative to that would be to lower the shutter speed. Although some cameras' ISOs can go super high, as in 12,800 to ISO, I would not recommend it because it would create abnormalities in the photograph that would end up looking like green and blue dots inside the frame. Now, if you set it to a reasonable setting, say 1600 or 3200, depending on which one works best for you, you can capture a low light image with a fast enough shutter speed in order to pick up the crispness of the frame, while the ISO would be able to compensate for the light. For me, the ISO would be a last resort in order to create a quality photograph in a low light environment. Lastly is the aperture, which I discussed earlier in the show. The aperture is the space between the blades and the lens that get exposed to light and passes said light on into the sensor to create the digital photograph. Now, you can set it to the lowest setting, 2, which is the widest the aperture can go on this lens, which allows it to work best in low light environments. Each lens has a different capability of f-stops or aperture ranges, and can be used in different situations to capture different images. Something to note is that not all lenses can have an automatic aperture ring, but most modern ones do. Although I spoke of accessories earlier, one of the most important ones to have is a camera strap. It allows you to be able to operate without having to hold the camera the whole time. You can move around, carry things, or even just relax and have the camera down by your side. Now, I have mine in a position that crosses my back, while other people might wear it in a more traditional sense where it would go just around your neck. So you've gone and taken some shots of places or people. That's great. The next step is to touch those photos up in post-production. Now, contrary to film cameras, you don't need a dark room to inspect how the photos came out. You could just take the SD card out of the camera and plug it right into your computer. As for editing, there's a bunch of ways you can touch that photo up, be it in your laptop, your phone, or even your camera. On a laptop, I use Adobe Lightroom, which is a paid application, but there's plenty of other free ones that are out there that can do the job just as well. Here are just a few of some of the edits that I've made, whether they be just touch-ups to a specific color or even toning down darks or whites to make sure that detail stands out. Now, on to the next one, my phone. There are plenty of apps out on the App Store or Android Marketplace you can use. For example, this is VSCO, an app that's currently free on the App Store. The only difference is that this one has a paid subscription for specific features that could be accessible in other apps for free. The thing you have to look out for with apps is what they have to offer. Editing on the camera is not recommended. mainly because the image you see on the screen is far too small, and if you do edit it in the camera, it can alter the image for good. Personally, I organize all my photos on an external drive, which makes it easier to categorize and also doesn't clutter my desktop. The program itself can allow you to sort through files on your desktop or any external drive you could plug in, like a flash card or SD. Now in this case, I'm sorting through my external drive, which I have most of my photos stored on, so I can show you how I would edit some things. So let's take a look at how to edit. Let's take a look at sports for a second. Now, this kind of photo would utilize high shutter speed as well as a low ISO with an aperture of your choosing. Now, you see here that I'm playing with various sliders on the right-hand side of the screen. Exposure determines how much light is amplified or muted in this case, where contrast shows how vivid the colors would be. Highlights would be generating the amount of detail coming from white surfaces, while shadows would bring out detail in black surfaces. Whites and blacks, in this case, dictate the amount that bright or dark surfaces would show detail or blow out into specific colors. Once I've adjusted the photo to my liking, here's how it came out in post. My shutter speed was 1/2000th of a second, my f-stop was at 2.8, and my ISO was at 125. The lens that I shot this with was a 300mm lens, which is quite heavy. I'd recommend using a monopod. An example of a portrait photo would be this here photo of Ben and Oliver. These two cuddly Yukon Husky dogs, even though they're not Huskies. But one thing you have to learn with portrait photography is that you have to make sure you can control or be able to capture the moment of your subject. And since Ben and Oliver are dogs, it is rather hard to work around them. While editing, I had to make sure that Oliver's fur, who was on the bottom, was able to show detail like the curves in his ears, while Ben's fur remained visible for the rest of the photograph. The issue that I was trying to avoid was the blending of colors that would mash the darks that are on Ben's nose and eyes and turn them into absolute nothingness. And in the end, the photo came out looking like this. The shutter speed on this photo was 1/200th of a second, the ISO was at 200, and the f-stop was at 2.0. Now, I shot this with a much smaller lens, which makes it much easier to get those personable shots. Editing with specific colors is very interesting, and in this case, Real Estate the Band played at the University of Connecticut for Subog. The lighting setup was very interesting. There was a lot of blues and a lot of purples. So what I wanted to do was get those colors and make sure those are the most prominent in an almost monochrome kind of way. So what I ended up doing for taking the photos was trying to get as close as possible to the stage to get the low angle look that I always like. Now what I'm doing here is there is a tone curve, which I'm not going to use because I'm not exactly 100% certain on it, but there's also sharpening and noise reduction. Sharpening brings out the detail in each and every edge, where noise reduction would do the opposite, and it would flatten the edges and almost give it a dream sequence-esque look. And you can see here with his hand, when you raise sharpening, it increases the visibility of the space between his fingers, where luminance or noise reduction would bring it down. Now, if I'm to sharpen, you can see more and more of the individual hairs on his beard, and that's what I ended up doing. In the end, the photo ended up looking like this. Due to the low light of the stage, I had to shoot at a much slower shutter speed than I would have liked, but I still got the photo I wanted. I shot this one at a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, the f-stop at 2, and the ISO at 1600. The trick to shooting concerts is always to illuminate your subject using either the side lighting or the stage lighting. Since in this case there was only side lighting, I had to position myself on the side to get the purples. One other example that I wanted to show is the regaining of skin tones in this case. Now, playing with exposure and contrast is good for the photo, but it's not going to do anything to bring out skin tone color. In this case, since purple is the primary color here, I used tint, and I had to set the tint all the way towards the green setting. We have tint goes to purple to green. Now there are a few other settings further on down in Lightroom, but in this case this is exactly what I was looking for. In the end, this is what it ended up looking like. This photo is taken at a shutter speed of 1/25 of a second. The ISO was at 1600 and the aperture was at 2.0. Now, there are plenty of other ways to bring out skin color other than using tint, but feel free to play around in Lightroom and figure out how to do it. That's our show. Thanks for tuning in. If you learned something new, that's great. If you already knew all that stuff, that's even better. If you're looking to do more with your camera, there's plenty of people who've written stuff online that are much smarter than me, and I implore you, go look for their stuff. You're bound to find something interesting, and I bet you're going to get that cool photo that's going to make everybody jealous. I'm Jon Sammis, signing off.